Yeah, it's 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
But I'm a late night person, so it's not
Oh.
very late for me.
Okay.
But it's going to be late soon.
Yeah.
We are live. We can start the session.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome for the session 8 of the third day of the International Multidisciplinary Symposium, Open Pages in South Asian Studies 4, on the theme, The Contemporary Dynamics of South Asia 2022. We have glimpses of South Asia today as a sub-theme for this session. We have with us for this session as speakers, Professor Mahendra Lavoti, Dr. Taymou Rahman, Ms. Khushi Kabir, Advocate Malka Fernando, and the chairperson for this session is Mr. Jatin Desai. The first speaker for this session is Mr. Taymou Rahman, who hails from Pakistan and is a man wearing many feathers in his cap, from being a musician, a social political.
Arundhati,
Yes.
Professor Lavoti will be speaking first. That is what his request was.
Is it? I had no idea. I'm so sorry. I had no idea.
Okay.
Okay, then we will shift accordingly.
I hope Dr. Taymou Rahman doesn't mind.
Absolutely not. No issue at all. No problem at all.
Okay. Okay, then let me correct myself. We'll begin our session with Professor Mahendra Lavoti. That's what I was wondering, because he said it's 1 o'clock and it would be too late for him because his in the order he was quite late. Okay, thanks for reminding me. Professor Lavoti possesses expertise in variety of fields from architecture to social sciences, encompassing urban and regional planning, international affairs, and eventually political science. He has been working as a professor at West Michigan University and has special interest in the areas of international development, democratization, ethnic and national politics, political exclusion, inclusion, and political institutions. He has authored many books on the themes related to South Asia and has been the president of the Association for Nepal and Himalayan Studies and an associate fellow of Asia Society. Privileged to have you here, Professor Lavoti. I request Professor Lavoti to deliver his speech on hegemony of a plural ethnic group despite periodic elections in Nepal, the role of formal and informal institutions. Professor Lavoti. Sir, please unmute yourself.
I'm trying to share my screen. Did it come? No, no.
Good morning. I'm Khushi Kabir.
In my share screen, I'm not been able to locate my.
Sahil, can you suggest something?
Just open that file.
Yeah, it's open.
Yeah, and from your Zoom screen, go to share option. Then you will see that file in your share window.
Share participant can share at a time, no? Or advanced sharing options.
Yeah. But we have made you co-host, so you can share the file.
Yeah, so one participant can share at a time, no?
Yeah, nobody else is sharing, so you can share without
But
any.
I can't, I mean, my file is open, but I don't see it. So that's why.
Oh. Is the file open on your computer?
Yeah, it's open on my computer.
It's open on your computer.
Let me just close down all of this stuff so that you don't see.
Shall I make you host? But that is, this is not the issue of permission, because we have already given permission of sharing to the co-host.
So no, when I should be seeing my file, no, so I can't see
Yeah,
my file.
So yeah, we can see it now.
Has
No,
opened.
you can see. Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let me. Sorry for this thing. Okay, so here I am. Sorry for the technical glitch. I'm presenting a paper on what I call the hegemony of a plural ethnic group despite periodic elections in Nepal. So what I meant by that is, let me just start my. So in Nepal, there is a hegemony of a group, ethnic group called Khas area, which is around 35% of the population. So its hegemony is in politics, top leaders of major political parties, parliament and cabinet, judiciary, bureaucracy, security forces, and including what in Nepal is called mainstream media and academia, as well as mainstream civil society. So just to, and including in the business sector, the economy. Just one example, the ethnic group has, since 1990, when democracy was reinstated, all prime ministers have come from one ethnic group. And mostly within that ethnic group, there are four castes, and Bahun, or known as Bahun, or what is basically Hill Brahmin, occupy disproportionate public offices. So this is interesting since, periodic elections has occurred in Nepal, and there is a strong anti-incumbency trend. No plural or majority political party has retained its majority or plural position in subsequent election. So that means it's a good sense, a good trend that there has been alternation of power. And some literature argue that competitive periodic elections lead to democratization. However, in Nepal, despite reasonably free and fair periodic elections, Nepal has not seen democratization along ethnic lines. So my question is, why has democratization not occurred on ethnic lines in Nepal? Or in other words, how has caste area continued its hegemony even in democratic polity or when there has been repeated periodic elections? So another thing is the demographic puzzle, in the sense that the dominant group is only 35% of the population. So it is less than 1/3 of the population. And basically four groups, Hill Brahmin or Bahun. We have Brahmin in the Tarai also, who are known as Madesi, but the ruling group is Hill Brown, then Kshatriya, which is 70%. Then there are other two smaller groups. So these are the ruling groups. Then other groups who are marginalized, indigenous nationalists constitute 36%, Madesi 20%, Dalit 13%. So, and ethnic politics literature has pointed out that when there are repeated elections, generally what happens is after some elections, you get a sense of ethnic census as the electoral outcomes. when generally to a considerable extent, different ethnic groups begin to vote for political parties they are associated with or affiliated with. So that is what the literature says. But again, in Nepal, we don't see that. There has been, number of elections, 6, 7 elections, but even after that, we don't significantly one ethnic group continues to dominate, not only in different sectors in politics, state, but including in what can be called civil society, media, and academia. So how has a political group with less than a third of a population managed to maintain its hegemony even in democratic population, democratic polity? So my explanation in this paper, there are other causes and other factors, but in this presentation, I look at institutional explanation of the hegemony. And I look at, my argument is, because just, going into demographic and democratic politics would not allow a plural ethnic group, which is less than a third of the population, to maintain its hegemony. My argument is the dominant ethnic group has established, instituted political institutions that has facilitated and enabled it to maintain its hegemony. So that would be my argument. And there are different factors that contributes to the domination, hegemonic domination. But here I'll basically focus on formal institutions, informal institutions, legal provisions, and policies that has enabled the group to maintain its hegemony. So let me just briefly talk about the new constitution, which was supposedly elected by a constituent assembly. And there are, in the constitution, some progressive elements. For example, a parliamentary system has been established. Monarchy was thrown out and a republic was established. So in that sense, these are positive aspects. So what we see in the constitution is, on political ideological issues, there are progressive elements. But when it comes to ethnic issues, there is exclusionary, status quoist, and regressive provisions in the constitutions. And the interesting point is, if you just look at the constitution, one may be, one may not see the regressive, the status quoist element, because in the preamble and at the initial pages of the constitution has included all the right words like human rights, reservation, secular state, socialism, and whatnot. So all the right words are included initially. However, in the subsequent provisions, there are exclusionary content. And I'll just give an example. For example, this constitution declares Nepal as a secular state. But in subsequent article, what it says is that the definition of a secular state is that the state will promote and protect ancient traditions. And what that means is, in a country like Nepal, where one dominant group has been dominating for 2 centuries, and the state is occupied by that dominant group, it has been interpreted to protect and promote Hindu religion in practice. So you have the right word, secular state, then but subsequently it has been qualified. And you can see this kind of trends, all the right words, but then they are qualified subsequently. So let me begin by just discussing some of the institutions, formal institutions. So let me begin by federalism. Nepal has adopted federalism, but it is a federalism that doesn't share power with different ethnic groups. So for example, there are 7 provinces, and out of the 7 provinces, Khas Arya is a majority or large plurality in 6 provinces. only in one province, Madisi are a majority. Otherwise, in all 6 provinces, they have been created in such a way that includes the mountains, that includes the hills, that includes even the lower Madhese plains and so on. But the aim has been to make sure that the caste area are demographically dominant, either a majority or plurality. And what that has enabled is, it has enabled the caste area to get a majority or large plurality of seats in 6 of the provinces, in 6 of the 7 provinces. That's what we saw in the first election. And it also enables the caste area to get a majority at the federal level. So basically what we see in the 7 province federal model is what I call a mono-ethnic federalism, whereby one group dominates 6 of the 7 provinces as well as the federal level. And basically, I mean, it has denied autonomous provinces to indigenous nationalities, who constitute 36% of the population, but are divided into around 60 different groups and so on. So, and this federal model was attained by denying or refusing other federal models. The 10+1 federal model was proposed by a constitutional commission, and during the first Constituent Assembly, it had support of more than 2/3 of Constituent Assembly members. But as I will make it clear in the last slide, this model was denied by not calling the full house of the Constituent Assembly and subsequently dissolving the first Constituent Assembly. So it has denied autonomous provinces to indigenous nationalities, but also the 10+1 model had envisioned a non-territorial federalism for the Dalits, the scheduled caste in India, because they are spread all across the country in Nepal. So then what we see is domination in politics has enabled domination in administration, security sector, civil society, and economic sphere. So this is one way of continuing domination. Then there has been co-optation through political reservation. And when I say political reservation, I mean Nepal has adopted proportional electoral method. So 40% of the representative in the provinces and at the center, at the federal level, are elected through proportional electoral method. And when you look at it, it sounds progressive. But if you analyze it, what you see is this has been a tool of co-optation and incorporation. For example, political parties are required to further divide the reserve quota along major ethnic groups. So this 40%, if a political party wins whatever sits under the proportional representative system, it has to divide along ethnic and gender lines, subdivide. And it looks good. I mean, it sounds good, no, in paper. Well, I mean, political parties are trying to include everyone. But what has happened in practice is it has enabled the caste area dominated political parties, which are on the top. The major political parties are led by caste area. So most of the influential leaders belong to the caste area. And it has allowed marginalized groups members to be co-opted at a lower level. Because what happens, I mean, you have joined the political party. Of course, you would like to get elected. And then you are positioned in as member of parliament, member of provincial assembly, and so on. And I say co-optation because the literature, including in India, Kanchan Chandra's book on the Bahujan Samaj Party and Van Cott in Latin America has pointed out that this kind of reservation, political reservation, has allowed co-optations of marginalized groups. In India, the Dalits, in Kanchan Chandra's case, in Latin America, the indigenous peoples. Because what happens is, according to them, if members of those those communities, Dalits, indigenous peoples, Madisi, etc., if they form their own political party, and if they lead certain political parties, then they can ensure and introduce reforms. But when they are just, middle level or lower level political members of a political party dominated by other ethnic groups, they cannot, bring about reforms and changes. And that is basically what has happened. In Nepal, the political parties are dominated by one ethnic group, and the policies they introduce favors their own ethnic groups and not to the voters who happen to be marginalized groups and their member of parliaments elected through proportional representative method who happen to be marginalized groups. So then there are legal constraints on marginalized groups. So Organization of Indigenous Nationalities have pointed out around 5 dozen discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. Similarly, Madisi organizations have also pointed out dozens of discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. Women have also pointed out discriminatory provisions in the Constitution. And discriminatory, in addition to the Constitution, there are other discriminatory legal provisions as well. For example, in terms of citizenship, in terms of, sending people for jails for allegedly killing cows and so on. Some of these, legal discrimination existed before the new Constitution, and they have continued with the new constitutions as well. And in citizenship, some of the discrimination has new discriminatory provisions have been introduced as well after the new Constitution was promulgated. So the discrimination, this type of discrimination has undermined the rights of marginalized groups. So they don't treat marginalized groups equally. For example, in Nepal, people without citizenship certificate cannot own land, cannot get government employment, cannot get a passport. So just imagine how a person who has been living in Nepal for generations, but somehow has been denied citizenship certificate fares in Nepal. So this is just some example. Then exclusionary policy examples. So this was some legal examples. I provided some institutional examples. Now, in terms of some policies, so in Nepal, it's a multilingual society. Around 123, 25 languages are spoken in Nepal. Language groups are in Nepal. But education, including at primary level, is conducted in Khas Arya or Nepali language. So what that has mean is numerous reports have shown that among the non-native speakers, there is a higher dropout rate. So what that means is basically capability of the people has been, non-native speakers of the language have been undermined. So they drop out, and even they don't drop out because of the language barrier. They cannot compete equally and so on. And as a result, because even the media is and government offices are run based on the language, the native speakers, the Khas Arya dominate media, academia, and other professional sectors. Then civil service exam is also conducted in the same language, Nepali, supposedly, and not in other languages. So what that means is non-native speakers of the language cannot compete on equal footing. And additionally, even only the Hill Brahmin have been doing well in civil service exam, because what people say is in the exam questions, writing Nepali makes a difference, and people who learn Sanskrit, they are better in answering questions, getting better marks, and so on. So it has resulted in highly disproportionate recruitment of caste area into civil services and security services. And because of those people, significant policy making and implementation bias continues. Because even when their intentions are not bad, their worldviews, their lifestyle, their priorities, and so on would be different from the marginalized groups. And when they govern based on what they think is the public good, it has harmed other communities, especially the marginalized groups and so on. And further, retired bureaucrats continue to serve in constitutional commissions, and most of these retired bureaucrats who have reached the top echelons of bureaucracy belong to the caste area, and policy biases continue even in those forums and platforms. So politics of nepotism now. In Nepal, politics of nepotism, ethnic favoritism, clientelism is widespread. And I guess to some extent, this is similar in other South Asian countries also, but it's widespread in Nepal as well. And it has affected political appointments, including in judiciary appointments. So in Nepal, there is a term they often use as setting. So you set in such a manner that you favor your ethnic group member, you favor your political party member, you favor your friends, family members, and he or she will favor your family members and so on. And in such cases, who benefits? People who are in power, people who are in top bureaucracy, top judiciary. They end up appointing their own, kins, friends, family members, and so on. So caste are benefit disproportionately since they are in the position of influence. And because of this, there are intentional as well as unintentional consequences. And unintentional consequences could be, for example, just information sharing by people of power, a network using for posting in good positions, promotions, etc., etc. And protection at the time of facing problems, including alerting or saving from corruption cases and so forth. So this nepotism this network are very ethnic, family, kinship, clientelistic network are very effective, and the same group has benefited. So because of that, now there has been economic benefits to the same group. So capital and wealth formation, public sector employment, including from unchecked corruption, whoever are in political power, political offices, in bureaucracy, in media, in human rights organizations, and so on. So, top, human rights organizations. Just to, alert you, in Nepal, even the human rights organizations are dominated by the caste area. So, then government contract, etc., have disproportionately also benefited caste area, and some studies have shown that as well. For example, traditional trading communities have lost ground on business areas where government network is important. When you need to have contract, get the contract or get license from the government, then caste area has emerged as strong business players because of their network and so forth. Some studies have shown, anthropological studies have shown this. So vicious circle of ethnic advantages continue as economically well-off are in a better position to provide good education, capital, etc. for the children. So in conclusion, hegemonic domination in different spheres have thwarted reforms, diluted reforms pushed by political movements, maintained status quo, and even introduced regressive laws and policies. When I say regressive laws and policies, for example, the new constitution, it has debarred a lot of, around a dozen top positions for naturalized citizens. So earlier it was not there, but now it has divided around a dozen, from prime minister to from province, chief minister of provinces and so on, around a dozen top positions. So it's regressive compared to the earlier constitution as well. And just to point out what happened was, so how did they manage it? So I'll just conclude with this slide. During the first Constituent Assembly, if you recall, I said that the reformers commanded a 2/3 majority. So if the Constitution Assembly had continued, then it would have instituted, it would have established, it would introduce many reforms, major reforms, including autonomous provinces for indigenous groups, non-territorial federalism for Dalits. But what happened was this vicious circle came into play, vicious circle of state and civic society domination. So what happened was media and academia created a very negative narrative against the reforms. Just since I have some time, just an example, what they said was, one of the most, heard phrase was, federalism would bring about ethnic conflict, massive, large-scale ethnic conflict. And oftentimes they used to talk about Rwanda, give example of Rwanda, where around 800,000 to 1 million people died during the ethnic conflict, ethnic violence. But in Rwanda, there was never federalism. So the ethnic conflict did not occur because of federalism. But in Nepal, the media, academia, and so on created such a narrative that common people believed that federalism would lead to ethnic violence and so on. And then Supreme Court intervened and forced a time frame. It was a political issue. The Constituent Assembly could have, extended its, tenure, but the Supreme Court, it extended tenure of the Constituent Assembly for a couple of times. Then it said it cannot. This is the last deadline that you have to promulgate a constitution. So what that enabled was that enabled the anti-reformist force to, cross the deadline and dissolve the Constituent Assembly. So then the speaker, hailing from a political party that publicly resisted the reforms, repeatedly refused to call a meeting of the full house. So everything was set. The Constitutional Commission had all the, provisions, all the things have been settled. All it was necessary was the full house of the Constituent Assembly to sit and pass by 2/3. And there was 2/3 support, but the speaker didn't, for around a dozen times he postponed the full house meeting of the full house. And finally the deadline crossed, so the Constituent Assembly was dissolved. And that happened, with the support of bureaucracy, security forces, leadership support the regressive forces. So what we see is, we see the vicious circle of civil society, including media, top human rights organizations, Supreme Court, judiciary, political parties, some of the political parties, and bureaucracy and security forces in thwarting the reforms. And then the second Constituent Assembly was elected. And as you recall, in Nepal, there is a strong anti-incumbency trend. So in the subsequent elections, the reformists lost the elections. The anti-reformists won the elections, and they pushed through a regressive constitution. A constitution that is regressive along ethnic lines and so on. So this is how plural ethnic group, which is less than 1/3 of the population, has been able to maintain an ethnic hegemony by establishing institutions that advantages it and disadvantages other marginalized groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lahoti, for your enlightening analysis on the regressive aspects of the policies in Nepal. and how the hegemonic domination is affecting the marginalized groups in Nepal. Thank you so much, sir. The next speaker of this session is Mr. Taymou Rahman, who hails from Pakistan and is a man wearing many feathers in his cap, from being a musician, a social political activist, to being an academic, teacher, and a writer. His book on the class structure of Pakistan has won much appreciation and an award for the best social science book in 2012. He is the one who lectures on capitalist exploitation and religious fundamentalism, and at the same time, the one who plays guitar and runs a progressive musical band, Lal. Welcome, Mr. Rahman, for this session, and he will deliver his speech. Mr. Rahman.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited by Shivaji University and the Russian State University for the Humanities to this seminar on the contemporary dynamics of South Asia. I would like to especially thank my friends Jatin Desai for inviting me, and Megha Pansari as well as Arundhati Pawar. Thank you so much for your patience and for the invitation. I say thank you so much for your patience because I realized that some of you wanted me also to do perhaps a little bit of music and speak on the youth movement in Pakistan. And it's just that my schedule has been so busy over the last week, 2 weeks, in fact, that I haven't been able to honor your request, but I hope to be able to do that in the future. So my apologies this time around. I felt that it was very important to talk about a phenomena that is on the rise in Pakistan, which has not really been addressed in the scholarly community. And although we see a lot of articles about it in the context of the media and journalism and so on, but there hasn't really been a very sustained engagement with the rise of Barelvi radicalism in the context of Pakistan in the recent past. Let me begin in the 1980s. The government at that time was a military dictatorship committed to the Islamization of society. Music was frowned upon. Women would be asked to not only cover their heads, but increasingly also to cover their faces. The public was being asked more and more to display public signs of religiosity. Alcohol consumption was strictly banned. Dance parties were thought of as an invasion of Western culture. Even the mere mingling of the sexes was considered a grave offense against religion. All this was officially sanctioned by the state. And then on PTV, a young woman from Sindh, whose hair was cut very short, who did not cover her head with a chadar, whose body language was unconstrained by the conventions of the times, burst upon the airwaves like a storm breaking through all natural and man-made barriers. I'm referring to Abida Parveen and her performance of Meri Yaar Di Ghadoli on PTV. You cannot imagine how it electrified Pakistani intellectuals, especially those of a democratic and progressive persuasion. Everything that the state was repressing seemed to be embodied in this young woman's performance of this Sufi classic, and it was irrepressible. In that instance, most of the modernist, liberal, and progressive intellectuals of Pakistan fell in love with Sufism as the expression of a secular, syncretic, tolerant, humanistic, and pluralistic movement within Islam. The historical precedent seemed to be well established, extremely well established. For generations, those who had sought to escape the oppressive grip of a puritanical form of Islam had always taken refuge in the doctrines of Sufism. The romance lasted for 4 decades. Whether it was the enlightened moderation of General Pervez Musharraf or the liberal populism of the Pakistan People's Party, the message was the marriage of the modernizing elite and Sufi Islam. This was a torrid affair. This was a love marriage. But as with all torrid affairs, everything has its limits. And this marriage is also ending in a messy and nasty divorce. Let us move away from the metaphors of love. The painful facts are that Sufism, which was to serve the role of de-radicalization of society, has itself been radicalized by society. The historical precedents were present, but we ignored them. They were ignored because the movement was confronted by opponents that were not more numerous, but certainly much more powerful and influential. There was not just the implacable opposition of mysticism to logic and rationality, which any philosopher can tell you with respect to Sufism. There was not just the denial of the materiality of the world. There was not just the fact that Sufism also played a role as the social managers of landed property, but there was also its own sectarianism and tendencies towards takfir, its own hierarchy of clerics, gaddi and sajda nasheens. But we simply could not see it. वो उर्दू में कहते हैं ना, डूबते को तिनके का सहारा. हमारा भी कुछ ऐसा ही हाल था. Ahmad Raza Barelvi's declarations of regarding the Ahle Tashi, Ahmadis, Wahhabis, and Deobandis as kafirs were present for all to read, but we were far too absorbed in the present. The elevation of the Prophet to divine status was plain for all to see, but we thought of it and accepted it as a poetry of love. The connections of the Peers and their shrine keepers to the landed structure of Punjab and Sindh was well known. It was well known, but we repackaged it as folk wisdom. In the period of General Musharraf, the state, after joining forces with the US against terrorism, institutionalized Sufi Islam in the form of the National Council for the Promotion of Sufism, which was established in 2006 under the leadership of the grandson of Allama Iqbal, Yusuf Salahuddin. The People's Party similarly strengthened the culture of Urs throughout the country as a counterweight to Deobandi Islam. And as with political forces, corporate forces also got into the act, and we saw the emergence of Coke Studio with the slogan, the sound of the nation. The Sunni Ittihad Council that grew out of this particular conjunction of historical forces threw its weight behind the anti-terrorism efforts of the government. Sarfaraz Ahmad Naimi organized huge demonstrations against the Taliban. He declared, quote, "The military must eliminate the Taliban once and for all, otherwise they will capture the entire country, which would be a big catastrophe," unquote. He passed a fatwa denouncing suicide bombings. He said that the Taliban leader Sufi Muhammad should, and I quote, "wear bangles if he is hiding like a woman," unquote. Forgive the toxic masculinity here, but this was considered an enormous insult. He said, and I quote, "those who commit suicide attacks for attaining paradise will go to hell as they kill many innocent people," unquote. Naimi was also the driving force behind the Tahaffuze Namuse Risalat Mahaz, which is a big word, but what it means is this is a front for the sanctity of the Holy Prophet. This was a group of over 20 Sunni parties raising their voice against violence committed by the Taliban. On 12th June 2009, the Taliban sent a clean-shaven 18-year-old young man to blow himself up and to kill Sarfaraz Naimi. His funeral was accompanied by many chants and slogans against the Taliban. But with Naimi gone, the militant anti-Taliban leadership of the Barelvi movement was beheaded. In 2010, the Sunni Ittihad Council, which was an alliance of 8 Sunni Barelvi organizations, launched the Save Pakistan movement against the Taliban. The Taliban continue to attack the leadership of the Barelvi organizations, especially with suicide bombings. And not only that, they also attacked shrines and religious festivals, wherever there was an urs held, those were also security risks, and there were many suicide bombings against the Barelvis. Bloodied and bruised, the Barelvis changed gears. Out of the rubble and the beheading of the old guard stepped forward a new leadership that had supposedly, quote unquote, learned the lessons of confronting the TTP and the Deobandi lobby. To win support, they now felt they needed a different strategy. Instead of attacking the Taliban, they reversed course and began to attack the government. They saw that they could gain more sympathy, especially by attacking the liberals, secular forces, and the modernists on the question of the finality of the prophet. And this would be a better path to outflank and out-radicalize the Deobandi radicals. In 2011, but the Barelvi ulema turned against the secular governor of Punjab, Salman Taseer. They attacked the governor for attempting to intercede on behalf of Asia Bibi, who was wrongly, in our opinion, accused of blasphemy. And also Salman Taseer was criticizing Article 295C, which are the blasphemy laws. The campaign against Salman Taseer reached a fever pitch until he was shot down by his own police bodyguard. His assassin, Mumtaz Qadri, was lionized by Khadim Hussain Rizvi, who went on to form the Tehreek-e-Labbaik party in 2015. In 2017, the TLP campaigned against the law minister, Zahid Hamid, over the fact that the anti-Ahmadi declaration in the electoral oath was changed from, and just a small wording was changed. And the change was that originally the wording was, I solemnly swear. And now the new wording was, I believe. And then the text was the same, which is that the Ahmadis are essentially non-Muslims. Nothing else in the text had changed, except the fact that instead of the words, I solemnly swear, the new words were, I believe. A very minor change, which makes no difference with respect to the legal standing of that particular clause. And yet the TLP went into high gear saying that this was an attempt to reverse the declaration, the constitutional declaration that made Ahmadis non-Muslims in Pakistan. They undertook a campaign and started a sit-in at Faizabad. The state and the government capitulated almost immediately. The only person perhaps in the state and in the government to have resisted was Justice Faiz Isa, who declared in his landmark ruling that the Faizabad protest was an act of terrorism. But sadly, that particular justice, that is Justice Faiz Isa, is now facing trumped up charges on corruption. Those are totally false and totally wrong and declared so by the Supreme Court. But he himself had to face the repression from within the government and state. The interior minister of the time, Ehsan Iqbal, was shot. There was an attempted assassination against him while he was addressing a public rally. He was shot in the shoulder. Luckily, the assassin could not fire a second shot. The crowd overwhelmed him, and he narrowly escaped with his life. The public, it is sad to say, has richly rewarded the TLP for changing its focus from the Taliban to the Ahmadis and to the protection of blasphemy laws. You cannot imagine how much popular sympathy they have gained as a result of changing their focus of attention away from the Taliban and towards the Ahmadis and against people who are considered to be liberal and secular. The complete inability of the government to control or even to present a cogent counter narrative to Barelvi radicalization has meant that the TLP may have already emerged as the third largest vote-getting party in the country. This is a huge, huge shift in Pakistani politics as we know it. And we're still trying to grapple with it and understand it. The result of this is epitomized in what happened recently, when a Sri Lankan manager working in Sialkot took down posters that were within the walls of the factory of the TLP, that were put up within the factory. He took them down so that the place would look clean before an inspection and before some guests were visiting. And the workers themselves lynched this manager. His body then was burnt by a furious mob out in the streets. Now, you may ask, is it unfair of me to say that the romance with the Barelvi Sufis as a peaceful, progressive, tolerant, pluralistic, secular, syncretic force is or must come to an end? In the context of a radicalizing society, and by radicalizing, I'm using that in the negative context. In the context of an overall radicalizing society, is it possible for any religious sect, even a Sufi Barelvi sect, steeped in centuries of mysticism or metaphysical thought, to evade, escape, or oppose radicalization? Is it possible for us who continue to aspire to a democratic, secular, pluralist society to rely on such forces in order to win the battle for secularism? Where the public has been brought up on a steady diet of religiosity at the expense of secular and democratic values, I ask you, is it not inevitable that the public too will reward those political forces that march to the beat of the times? Some may object and argue that Sufism as a doctrine is not to blame for the actions of the TLP, and that there is still hope to create a tolerant and free society from within the framework of Sufi Barelvi Islam. I too, of course, have sung songs and continue to sing songs that are steeped in the Sufi tradition. I think most of the audience may already know this. So while the jury remains out on that particular question, I must state that doctrines themselves make no history. Doctrines take no actions. Doctrines have no consciousness. They have no individuality, agency, or understanding of historical forces. Doctrines are not people. It is not doctrines that make history, but people who make history. And people as a whole couldn't care less for the internal contradictions of their actions in relation to their doctrines, or their doctrines, or the contradictions within the doctrines within themselves. The competitive struggle between different sects of Islam to capture the increasing radicalized populace is sadly driving Pakistani society towards a religious sectarianism of dangerous proportions. And although I would like to end this short submission by stating that the newly growing progressive students movement in Pakistan will overcome, I am forced to end with the cliche that the optimism of my will is unable to overcome the pessimism of my intellect, at least for the moment. Thank you so much. Be happy to take your questions, comments, and criticisms.
Thank you, Mr. Rahman, for your factual account of the extremism in Pakistan and the anxiety of the secular and progressive minds. Let us hope that the progressive movement will give more hope to the conditions in Pakistan. Any questions, or should we move on, Megha?
I think Jatinji will tell us how to lead.
Megha, I think you can decide, but surely I think that everyone would like to know from Taymou, because he's right now is at the forefront of the movement of students and youth. He goes to villages and sings songs. And for the first time, even in some villages in Sindh, they got tremendous response. And for the first time also, his party comrade is elected as a mayor. So I think that if we can for about 5 minutes, if Taymou can say about students movement and what kind of feedback he's getting when he's moving around in villages and other cities.
Thank you very much, Jatin. That's why I sort of left this open because I thought you would be interested in this aspect of Pakistan. I think while it is true that there has been there are, let's say, grounds for cautious optimism for the reasons that you have described. The student movement is very, very active, and there are a lot of young people today, thousands of them, I would say, who are very interested in progressive politics. It was not the case when I came back to Pakistan after my studies and I joined the left in Pakistan. At that time, there was no, at that time, this was fresh into the breakup of the Soviet Union and the dismemberment of the left. And although the organized left was still relatively intact in the 1990s, but in the rest of society, people had moved away from any interest in leftist discourse, etc., or ideas. That is no longer the case, thanks mainly to social media. Social media has played a very important role in recreating an enormous interest amongst thousands of Twitter and Facebook users within the left. That can be seen, if you join the pages that Pakistani young people visit. They are very large pages. They are very big followings. Lots of things are being shared. There are several key things that we can talk about. One of which you have mentioned, of course, the victory of Salar Fayaz Ali of the Mazdoor Kisan Party in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a very, very big thing. The other big thing is the rise of the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, where thousands of young Pashtuns follow people like Manzoor Pashtun, and then there's the formation of the Pakistan Democratic Movement, which is again an outgrowth of Pashtun Tahaffuz movement. So there is that. Within Sindh also, I think it's fair to say I've received a very good response there. But it is fair to say that Sindh continues to hold on to those secular pluralistic values. And I have enormous hope that, from Sindhi progressive intellectuals, maybe it's misplaced, but I really do feel that that is really still a bastion of progressive thought within Pakistan. So there are also other things that I can talk about within the peasantry. Part of the reason why we have been receiving such a fantastic response, singing in villages, etc., is I think has to do with the fact that we've also been becoming better musicians over time. So we're performing much better than we were before. We're communicating much better than we were before. And you're right to point out that it is still a very large constituency of people who want to talk about class politics, who want to talk about the rights of poor people. And want to talk about what is in this whole framework for us in terms of the real choices in life about healthcare and education and jobs and our everyday economic and political problems. So that exists, and that is room for cautious optimism. But it is pitted against these glimmers of hope, these sort of light at the end of the tunnel. You have to remember has still not reached the scale where it can impact national politics. Because what we are talking about when we look at the other side, the right-wing conservative side, we are talking about people in the millions on that side. Recently, for example, in the elections before last, the TLP polled 2.2 million votes. The whole of the left in Pakistan cannot get together and poll even 100,000 votes. Salar Fayaz Ali polled 14,500 odd votes. all the left, if it gets together, I guarantee we cannot probably cross 20, 30,000, 40,000 maybe votes. So the scale at which the right is operating is a very different scale from the scale at which we are operating. But we are growing, and we are optimistic, and we're not giving up, and we will continue to fight the good fight. And I think some forces are beyond the control of individual efforts. Some forces are created or destroyed or move in accordance with larger historical factors. In the end, I think we are also seeing, and the last thing I would say is that in the end, we are also saying that these right-wing forces, whether we are talking about conservative right-wing forces like Imran Khan, PTI, etc., or we are talking about far-right forces like the Taliban, the TTP, the TTA, or the TLP, or other such forces, they cannot solve the fundamental problems of the people. And the more they are unable to solve the fundamental problems of the people, the more they resort to absurdities and extremist measures that force people to the conclusion that these people do not have the solution to our problems. And that, I think, is probably the contradiction that can once again move Pakistani society towards a progressive future and all that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rahman, for giving an optimistic picture towards the conclusion of your speech. Thank you so much. I think we should move on to our next speaker, Madani Malka Fernando from Sri Lanka. She is an attorney at law and women rights activist from Sri Lanka. She is a member of the Democratic People's Movement in Sri Lanka, which is a coalition of people's movements, NGOs, and trade unions initiating action and dialogue for alternative development paradigms. She is a president of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism and the Women's Forum for Peace in Sri Lanka. I request Nimalka Fernando ma'am to deliver her speech on Sri Lanka and South Asian strategic concerns.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. I have to thank the Shivaji University and the Department of Foreign Languages and the Russian International Center for South Asian Studies for inviting me for this symposium. And of course, like my previous speakers, I have to thank Jatin for linking me to this very important process, and also Megha and the rest for keeping us linked via emails. And I see a lot of colleagues from South Asia joining the symposium. I have been listening to the symposium from time to time, and the symposium has been focusing on South Asia, its past and contemporary challenges, ranging from social, economic, political, and cultural. For many years, probably, from the time the official SAARC was launched, civil society activists in the region have been engaged in dialogues of this nature. We call them convening solidarities of human rights and democratic loving people, solidarities on peace and security, where we women in South Asia converged to discuss the cross-border challenges. The fact that I'm here in this very important symposium talking to you about Sri Lanka and our woes as people, and also how as Sri Lankan citizen, we see the position of our country in South Asia is linked to this long-standing solidarity we have evolved among the people, activists, academics, artists, painters, and also victims of human rights violations in our region. Families of hundreds and thousands of people who have disappeared due to political and ethnic violence and pogroms. And women, of course, in South Asia, who are yearning to create a violence-free South Asia, and of course, a South Asian home that is free of violence. Today, as I speak to you as a Sri Lankan, it is with a sense of despair I stand before you. I could cry if I can cry, as our country is struggling to overcome a huge economic crisis. The simple fact is Sri Lanka has no foreign currency to purchase fuel and other essential commodities like medicine.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Sorry.
Malka, ma'am, please.
Okay, so I have to repeat. Do I have to repeat again?
Little bit.
Yes. Okay. It is with a sense of despair I stand before you today as the country is struggling to overcome a huge economic crisis. The simple fact is Sri Lanka has no foreign currency to purchase fuel and other essential commodities like medicine. We have lost on many fronts during the pandemic period. Loss of revenue from tourism and migration, also from the export industry. Amidst all that, we have to pay debts. The country resumed the swap business. The economists listening to me would know this. We, in fact, borrowed from Bangladesh to pay debtor number one. Then we borrowed from India to pay Bangladesh. Then we took a credit line from Qatar to purchase fuel. Then we borrow from somebody else, from China, to pay Qatar. So this is going on and on. How we will overcome this crisis, we really don't know. Whether we will go to IMF or allow some super giant in the world to gobble up, who knows? Now, if you look at Sri Lanka followed a foreign policy. We have been grounded on non-alignment for years. The Bandaranaike era is always remembered when we speak of our relationships with the neighboring countries. We were proud to say, and I was proud to say as a Sri Lankan, that we uphold Indian Ocean to be a peace zone. As a youth activist, I was very proud to say this at all international peace symposiums. But the situation has changed dramatically as we have become today a country that is trying to balance its strategic location between two giants, or what our rulers claim, two friendly nations, India and China. There are many causes to this story, but the ethnic conflict that resulted in a brutal war with the LTTE resulted in heavy borrowings and subsequent infrastructure building. Call them soft loans, call them hard loans. The color of non-alignment got transformed as we fought a battle at the international level. As human rights violations reached a gigantic peak. At the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Sri Lanka was named and was required to investigate into war crimes. In the international scene, friends and foes appeared. While China and Pakistan unreservedly support Sri Lanka, call in the conflict an internal affair, India and Japan remain neutral. Japan, being the largest donor that supported Sri Lanka up till 1990, wanted a soft approach. The Western Bloc therefore became those supporting terrorists and those harming the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. This position got transmitted in the minds of the citizens in Sri Lanka. The political game inside even up to now, is played as the imperialist West and the friendly neighbors, China, the land of Mao. This was ably supported by the right-wing political party, by the left-wing political parties who formed a grand coalition with the right-wing political parties or middle path political parties of Mahinda Rajapaksa regime in 2006. Sri Lankan government since then has entered into huge mega projects with China based in strategic locations. Supported by China, the port in Hambantota, in the creation of the port city in Colombo, filling thousands of acres of ocean clearly showed to the world that Sri Lanka is in the largest Silk Road line of China. All indications are that it would remain as decided by China. In the Indian Ocean, known as the Maritime Silk Road, and is part of the bigger development strategy known as the One Belt, One Road. Then enters the brother India and supports Sri Lanka to repair the oil tanks in the Trincomalee Harbour, support the development of a new airport, Mattala, just next to the Chinese port in Hambantota, and also supporting the upgrading of the airport in Jaffna in the north to facilitate direct flights from the north to South India, where predominantly the Tamil-speaking people are residing and has its close connection to South India. With each government in power after the end of the war, Sri Lanka has played this game. Both China and India has expanded its tentacles into the Sri Lanka and through that to the Indian Ocean. This month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, I'm just sharing with you the contemporary challenges. You may ask questions later, but to give you a bird's eye view of what is happening to this country that all of you call the pearl of the Indian Ocean, subsequently the blood drop, the teardrop of the Indian Ocean. Today, what is happening to Sri Lanka? Just this year, this month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Sri Lanka and the Maldives. On the surface, the trip was part of an effort by China to make further inroads into South Asia and cement its presence in the Indian Ocean. But it also reflects a new regional trend in which smaller South Asian states like India, like Sri Lanka, seek to maximize their political and economic gains as competition between India and China intensifies. According to analysts, these deals came despite the island states' so-called India First policy to reprioritize its ties with New Delhi and limit its dependence on Beijing. This visit came on the heels of a less successful year for China in the Maldives and coincided with the former Maldivian President Abdullah Yamin's India Out campaign, which politicizes New Delhi's role as a security provider. Few days later, what happened? The Indian Foreign Minister visited Sri Lanka. His visit came as Sri Lanka began to play its India card against China. Last year, Sri Lanka banned fertilizer imports from China, and Beijing's angry response led to Colombo to seek emergency supplies from New Delhi by way of nano fertilizer, which India gave to us as a gift. Sri Lanka also cancelled Chinese energy projects in the Jaffna Peninsula in the north and offered India a deal to modernize an oil terminal in Trincomalee. These developments are part of a significant phenomenon among South Asia's smaller states, playing China and India against each other as they vie for greater regional influence. Even Bangladesh and Nepal, traditionally closer to India, have begun to actively balance between the two Asian giants. India's policies in Sri Lanka and Maldives last year are a case in point for a more proactive diplomacy. In Sri Lanka, India has consistently bargained to maintain its presence in the major Colombo port project and to cancel the Chinese energy projects in the Jaffna Peninsula. It has also continued offering currency swaps to Sri Lanka after withholding these requests for years. Colombo just received this year a new currency swaps and $1.5 billion in financial assistance from India. In the Maldives, India was working in more than 45 major development projects by mid-2021. This new regional order will be a long-term affair, as neither India nor China intends to back down from competing in and for South Asia. New Delhi and Beijing will keep providing more financial incentives and lending to smaller states, which will continue to play both countries against each other in the hope of finding more sustainable and beneficial investments. Ideally, this strategic competition will provide some escape for further debt-trapped diplomacy and unsustainable borrowing from a country like Sri Lanka or poorer countries. Now, if you look at what happened from the time of pandemic, which struck Sri Lanka last year, China has topped the charts in providing crucial support to Sri Lanka by way of 2 billion in loans and a currency swap, and Sinopharm vaccines totaling over 1 million in donation and about 6 million for procurement so far. However, despite the past pandemic time assistance, presently, China is also under more public scrutiny in the island nation than ever before. I'm quoting analysts. This is very significant because in Sri Lanka's single nationalist political landscape, resistance to imperialist West and an interventionist India is a very popular political position, which dominated the rhetoric in the Sri Lankan single majority South since independence, through civil war, and in the decades after. But today, there is growing skepticism of China in public discourse and the media, including we see cartoons alluding to the dragon or the Chinese flag, which to me is a very different phenomenon. This happened during the last 2 months with the port city projects and boards appearing in Mandarin in the port city. The sentiments came to the fore last year in May when the government passed the controversial bill which governed the China-backed Colombo port city, which was challenged in court, which discussed the issue of sovereignty in Sri Lanka because that section has its own company to control its trade, its investment. But, the civil society activists and the political activists lost that case. And during the recent controversies over signboards in public places and government offices that included Mandarin and excluding Tamil, which is the second national language in this country. In resistance to Port City Bill, we were discussing with some Buddhist, influential Buddhist monk. They would say, we will never allow a Chinese colony in this country. I would like to just conclude my session by saying, whatever government that comes to power, we have not been able to extricate from the relationship. We need to have the South Asian relationship. We as South Asian people have always yearned for this people-to-people movement in South Asia. We have yearned for a interaction with the South Asian people, a visa-free zone for South Asia. And we have been working on solidarities. But on the other hand, we also know how these state-to-state interrelations have affected even our movements, even in our advocacy with regard to human rights, even in our advocacy with regard to expanding women's rights, religious harmony. We in South Asia, the civil society has been facing all these challenges. Amidst that, we see the larger international dimensions or the larger political superpower competition that is engulfing us. I would just like to show you a map of Sri Lanka to just give you a bird's eye view of what I'm talking about. Now, if you take this map, this is Sri Lanka. The Jaffna International Airport, which controls the northern part of the Indian Ocean, was developed by India with the Indian support in 2015. We now have the oil tanks agreement signed with India, where 60% of, it has like 90 tanks. This is the most natural harbor in this region. This is now developed and contracted to India. This part, which is the southern region, which is the Hambantota port, this is a mega Chinese Sri Lanka project, which was signed in 2006 2017 or prior to 2017 by the Mahinda Rajapaksa regime soon after the war. And then just next to that, this Mattala airport was developed by India. Now we have this mega development project, which is called the Port City project, where China has acquired over so many acreage. This part of the Indian Ocean, this part of Sri Lanka has been now filled with soil. And this is where the largest, one would say, the nightlife, casino, free investment, any washing your dollars, anything can happen, because this area is governed by a special law. And, of course, Sri Lankan representatives would be there. And this is where we saw the board coming up with Mandarin and with not the Tamil language. So you would see this country, and I'm not talking about this part of Sri Lanka, where is also a Chinese larger infrastructure development is taking place. So you would see north, east, south, west, the intrusions that is happening in the name of development. And I would like to say how the loving neighbors are embracing Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka is also a country haunted. I would end with this. Sri Lanka, despite this economic crisis, with this economic crisis, is also a country haunted by the violence and grief of 30 years of war. The rulers have failed to lead the country into healing of the wounds of the war or the brutality of the war. The hope we glimpsed in 2015 for transitional justice was shattered in 2019 as the Rajapaksa regime came back to the helm. We also passed a constitutional amendment last year, which is called the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, whereby we gave power, the parliament gave power to the president, executive powers, so that presently the parliament is just merely a rubber stamp. All independent institutions that we established, Human Rights Commission, Police Commission, Office on Missing Person, all commissions presently are appointments and removal of commissioners are in the hands of a parliamentary committee, but the overall authority of who comes into these commissions, who is appointed, is in the hands of the executive. So that is where we are in Sri Lanka. I will end my brief presentation, leaving room for you to ask questions.
Thank you, ma'am. Any questions? Or should we move ahead?
I'm sorry that I had muted earlier. I was thanking you for inviting me for the symposium, and I was sharing with you that this symposium brings us solidarities of South Asia, and we have been, as people of South Asia, was working on issues of human rights, democracy, cross-border issues, and this symposium, I wanted to say that this is also another solidarity that is bringing all the experiences of South Asian people. And I'm humbled to be invited for that and to be sharing my experiences with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nimalka.
Ma'am, I have a question. I
Yes.
mean, in the light of current crisis in Sri Lanka, would there be any effect on the India-Sri Lanka relationship? I mean, all types of relationships. Would you like to?
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. India, Sri Lanka, I would say India and Sri Lanka will have its relationships very, very closely tied, because on one hand, we are linked historically to India, because we have a large population of Indian workers who have come and who have settled down in hill country. They are our citizens, but at the same time, India is supporting large development, social welfare projects for this population in the hill country who are our main income earner by way of tea. And on the other hand, we have the north. We have a large, we have the Tamil speaking people in the north and east. And you know that we have had this conflict for a long time, and India have been involved in supporting Sri Lanka in terms of reaching a long-standing political solution that also links to the politics in Tamil Nadu. So I don't think our relationships with India can be washed away so very easily. We as progressive people in Sri Lanka would always urge all Sri Lankan governments to strengthen its ties with India.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, but taking into account the kind of economic support that Sri Lanka has been receiving from China, I mean, there are a variety of opinions. I mean, varied opinions are there that there might be some influence of that support on India-Sri Lanka relations.
I think in terms of billions and millions, there is an encirclement, but I suppose the people of Sri Lanka will always want its sovereignty and its relationship with India sustained. And if you see the anti-Chinese public opinion that is, this anti-Indian Indian opinion arose even in 1987 when the IPKF was here in Sri Lanka. People were even, we were laughing, people wearing Indian saris were demonstrating in front of the Indian embassy. Our clothes, the sari I'm wearing is from India. My kurtas are brought from India. So in terms of market, we depend on India, right? So despite all these conflicts, I think it will be very difficult for Sri Lanka and Sri Lankan political leaders to take such a foolish decision. I would consider it a very short-sighted decision, if that it may be, but I don't think so. If you look at the foreign policy handling now, we are, that is why I'm saying, very unfortunately, it's a strategic game Sri Lankan politicians are also playing. Today, India, tomorrow, China. Today, India, tomorrow, China. So this is what is the fate you should understand. I'm not a fate, I'm not giving into fate, but this is how the balancing act is happening here. But I don't think Sri Lanka can take one decision. We are non-aligned. I mean, I think the people of Sri Lanka is grateful to Mrs. Sirima Bandanayake for putting that in our political and social mind, that we must remain a non-aligned nation. And I suppose that struggle will be the future struggle of the political leaders in the country who are now talking about this very, very serious game playing that is happening. Some of us in the civil society are committed to non-alignment of my country.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for discussing elaborately the contemporary issues in Sri Lanka in relation to and the challenges of Sri Lanka.
Oh, somebody has asked a question for me about the American involvement in Sri Lanka. There are no direct interventions, but in terms of the UN human rights lobby, America played a big role in bringing a UN resolution and supported the UN resolution, which Sri Lanka has sort of moved out. So there is no direct investment, but there is a power plant which was signed with an American company that is now being challenged in Supreme Court. No direct intervention, but I will not rule out the indirect interventions, which of course you will have to have another international forum to discuss about that, how that happens.
I think we should move on. Megha?
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Let's move on to the next speaker of this session. Madam Khushi Kabir from Bangladesh. Madam Khushi Kabir is a social activist, feminist, and environmentalist. She has worked with many NGOs since the very beginning of her career, and that made her connected with the underprivileged rural communities and their problems. Throughout her life, she has been actively involved in the movements of promoting gender equality, rights of women, indigenous people, and other marginalized communities, land and water rights, secularism, environmental justice, food sovereignty, ensuring democratic values and accountability are some of our many social concerns. It is a privilege to have Madam Khushi Kabir for this session to speak on the topic, Essential of Inclusive Culture in South Asia, a Bangladesh Perspective. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank the Shivaji University, Kolhapur, the Department of Foreign Languages and Department of Marathi. I want to thank the Russian State University for the Humanities in Moscow, particularly the Faculty for International Relations, Political and Foreign Area Studies, and of the Institute of History and Archives and the International Center for South Asian Studies. I particularly want to, like everybody else, thank Jatin, who has selected his friends for this panel. And it has been a very rich discussion that I have heard so far. I want to thank Megha and all her colleagues for being, very clear in keeping touch and keeping us informed and ensuring that we are here on time. So thank you all. It gives me great honor and privilege to be present here today and to talk about a topic that I feel so passionately about. And I think it's a topic that all of us feel passionate about. And I think all the previous speakers before me have raised this issue in some way or the other. The topic that I've been given, as you have mentioned, is the essential of inclusive culture in South Asia and in the Bangladesh perspective. And I think many other speakers, especially, have talked about the essential of inclusive culture, especially the speaker from Nepal and the speaker from Pakistan. Excellent presentations, and I think a lot of it would, would resonate with what I want to speak about. So I just want to talk about the prevalent culture that existed in the late 60s, the 70s, 80s. And I talk about the 60s, 70s, 80s, though the culture existed before that, is because that's the time when I grew up. And it was a culture of a very positive and progressive ideology, where we talked about equity, social equity, economic equity. We talked about socialism. We talked about secularism. We talked about democracy and accountability. And in our region, many of our countries were facing military dictatorships, and if not military dictatorships, at some points of our life have been under emergency rule. So that was the atmosphere of that time, and a lot of young people took that up. Globally, I'll come back to 1971 and what this meant for our liberation war at a slightly later stage, but I just want to talk generally and then come to Bangladesh. Globally, the culture is that of a majoritarianism. And when I say globally, I really mean globally, because that's what you see in almost every nation and state. Governments, whether elected or not, are all mainly authoritarian in their acts and the behavior. There's a total lack of transparency, of accountability, of people being able to, of the citizens of this country, which everyone's constitution keeps talking about, the citizens being the main owners of the constitution and the nation, and so the accountability to them. And because of all this lack and the kind of the culture of impunity that exists amongst the more powerful, the human rights violations of any type of dissent or even any kind of peaceful demonstrations is something that is quite prevalent in this region. We saw the recent strike that the farmers in Punjab, Haryana were doing, and it's at a great cost. They got concessions, and let us see what the impact and its actually implementation would be. So if I have to talk about what does inclusive culture mean, what are the essentials or elements of inclusive culture? We have to look at the inclusive culture politically. We have to look at how the bureaucracy, which runs the country, the administration of the country, the institutions of the state that are supposed to be independent, how it and organs of the state that are supposed to be independent, that is the judiciary, the parliament, the laws enforcing agencies, the armed forces, etc., including the non-state actors like the media and cultural forums, etc. We see that they are not allowed to be. The ones that are run by the state are deliberately acting in ways that suppress any kind of action or active engagement with the people. And there is new laws coming in to suppress any kind of questioning, any kind of exploring new ideas and expressing one's opinion. The armed forces play, in many of our countries, if not in all, but in some of our countries, the armed forces play a very important role. And though they may not be in power, like if I had mentioned Bangladesh here, they may not be in power since 1990, but we see that every government that comes to power panders to the armed forces in a way, and that the armed forces are themselves getting a lot of benefits by being part of the business and commerce, owning the five-star hotels and huge golf courses and other industries, etc., even in the service sector. We see that the business sector is another sector that is pandered to in all our countries. Corporatization of everything, including from the agriculture of the marginalized peasant, the one who used to be first producing for their own means and their own needs, the subsistence farmer. The pattern of agriculture has changed to corporatization and to the market. And if we just look at Bangladesh, again, though I said I'll talk about Bangladesh later, but I just want to give you an example that in Bangladesh, about 80% of the parliamentarians have stated as their main occupation being business, which is a total change from what we had seen in the 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., where people who were in politics and grew up in politics with the people and having to reach out to the people are no longer the ones making the decisions or making laws. So the last group that is being pandered to, especially in many of our countries, and I can see it in our neighboring countries, definitely. I would probably, here in Nepal also, I could say that it's happening there too, is the use of religion. Religious majoritarianism rules undaunted and pandered to and supported by financially and in every way by the parties in power, and even those parties who are wanting to or aiming to come into power. So here I will just say, I'll come to Bangladesh now. And when I spoke at the beginning about the kind of situation we were in, we spoke about the kind of ethos that we were living in, the kind of culture and the type we were living in, times we were living in, led to Bangladesh fighting its war of independence, its liberation war as we called it, where the majority of the people of this country, whether they were peasants, whether they were workers, whether they were students, whichever class they belonged to, this was absolutely a very leveling war that we fought, where the freedom fighters, who were the guerrillas, fought together side by side with everybody. And the main principles we fought for were democracy, our own cultural identity, and the right to our language and our culture. Secularism was a very important part, because we were fighting to break away from Pakistan, which was based on a religious identity. So we wanted to have a secular identity and believed in a secular identity. And so we wanted to talk about these four institutions. Socialism, that was the fourth. Now, Bangladesh has, I'll just talk about, when we talk of inclusiveness, we talk about then who are the excluded and who do we want to include, and why do we talk about inclusiveness, right? So, so this inclusive culture means that we need to identify who are the ones that are being excluded. Some are being excluded on the basis of their economic status, their geographical status. I mean, the rural-urban divide is quite strong. In the rural areas, you have a very strong class divide. In the urban areas, you have a very strong class divide. So if you are very marginalized economically and living, and you are excluded from most any policies, etc., and you're not part of it. There may be policies aimed at you, but not with you and not taking you into consideration. So we have that. We have a very gendered, we have a very, very patriarchal society. So women are another part of those who are excluded. We have the indigenous communities, and we do have over 60 or 70 indigenous communities living in Bangladesh. Some say more. There's never been any official statistics done. Once the government tried to do it and said there were only about 35 or 40, and we showed that there was much more and over 70, but there may be subgroups, so it could be more than that. So indigenous peoples are considered as not being in the mainstream, and so therefore excluded in every form whatsoever. Religious minorities. I'd just like to state here and let you know that when we got liberated in 1971, December 16th, the percentage of non-Muslims in Bangladesh was over 20%. The current situation, and we don't have the 2021 figures yet. I think there was, because of the pandemic, there was this sort of, the first year of every decade is when you have the census done. But as per all the government's statistics, we are around 10% or a little less than 10% of the population who are now non-Muslims. That means around 13 to 14% of the non-Muslim populations have gone down. And that is something that does worry us, and does it's of great concern, because this is not what our liberation war was all about. We see that from secularism, when the military first came to power after the brutal assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, his family and his cohorts, the first thing they struck out was secularism. They did not strike out socialism. They thought socialism was something that would not matter that much, or that it would not really take place. By then, the Cold War had begun to end, etc. So the first thing they struck out was secularism, and replaced it with Islam as a state religion. It's not an Islamic Republic of Bangladesh. It's still called the People's Republic of Bangladesh officially. And it's because of over the years, there have been cases, writ petitions. So the old constitution was supposed to be brought back. So secularism is brought back into our constitution, but Islam as a state religion stays intact in our constitution, which is a dichotomy. And you have Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim written on top of the constitution. So it's really a contradiction in many ways, leaving a lot of non-Muslims, the religious minorities, feeling very vulnerable in such a situation. And when I spoke before about pandering to religion, we see the immense amount of money being spent by the government and allowing Islamization to take place in a very large way. We have more madrasas now in our villages and over the country than we have primary schools, which is really a sad fact because this was not the case before. The government has approved, for those who will not know, there is two kinds of madrasa educations prevalent. I'll just give a very broad thing of the two kinds. One is the Alia Madrasa, which was approved by the British and which is approved by the government. And the Alia Madrasa is a madrasa board that is controlled by the government and the syllabus that is controlled by the government. And then you have the Qawmi Madrasas, which follow their own curriculum. They will not allow the government to ever have any say in what they are teaching, how it is run, whether it is run properly or not, who is in its board or anything at all, neither in the curriculum nor in the running. So these Qawmi madrasas have the highest degree, which is now being recognized by the government as equivalent to a master's degree. And the dangers of this, I think, is manifold, because it's in these Qawmi madrasas where there is no way of ever monitoring or seeing what is happening, that a lot of, was mentioned, that the negative form of radicalization of religion begins and takes place. And once you recognize it, that means these people can then start asking for jobs in the administration, in the army, etc., everything. So when we look at our what this has meant in Bangladesh, we see the growth of attacks on minorities. The recent attack that really worried us a lot, very seriously, was during October, during the Durga Puja. Now, Durga Puja is a very large festival in Bangladesh, in all of Bengal actually, but also in Bangladesh. And then Durga Puja does not only pander to the Hindu population. It is a festival where everybody goes. I have often visited the Durga Puja mandaps, as with everybody else, everyone does that. And basically because of many different roles that we've played, we get invited to especially. And I often see there are girls in hijabs who've come with their parents and other people who all come to participate in the puja festivities. They may not do the puja themselves, they may not do the puja, but they enjoy the festivities so much so, they even take the little offering that the religious priest offers, take part in there's a dance competition that is a dance devoted to the goddess Durga. And there are Muslims who are participating in that competition, and quite often they even win the competition. So I just mentioned this is that during Durga Puja, it's huge and there's massive crowds. You need to have, you have to stand in a long queue to be able to enter the puja mandaps. And puja mandaps are built all over across, in fields, they just take it over and it's done collectively. It is the one Hindu festival that is done by the community for the community, and the community being beyond the Hindu community. This year, there was a series of attacks on Durga Puja at the puja mandaps. And the first one that happened, the inaction by the government to try and curb that had it spread across Bangladesh in many places, after which the government then started taking action. But the fact that they could simultaneously, all over the country, do this, which was something that was, accepted by the Muslim community too, and every other community, as something that is just a cultural, place that you participate in. That doesn't mean you are giving up your religion. So that this could have been done was a way, in my opinion, showing the strength and the power of the religious extremist groups, fundamentalist groups, that they are still active, they are still very much there. The reason I say they are still active and still very much there is because if I look at earlier on, like 2013, 14, 15, until 16, there were attacks on individuals who were secular. They may have been bloggers, they may have been teachers, they have been writers, they've been cultural activists, they have been publishers, and they were hacked to death in the name of Islam. And it's only when there was a very upmarket Gulshan, which is the posh area where the diplomats and expatriates who come in to invest in Bangladesh live. In one of the restaurants, there was an all-night attack where were about 24 or 5 people who were killed. And after that, the government moved in and took action. So then it stopped for a while. But this again showed that they are still active. Before this, there have been, isolated incidents against the Buddhists in Ramu, in Cox's Bazar. The temples were burnt, and the Buddhist community homes, their homes were burned. There have been attacks with the Hindus in 3-4 places, attacks on the church in 1 or 2 areas, but these were sporadic, not having an attack in one area and then quiet for a year, and then after that in another area, another community. But this, the puja, attacks during the puja time, showed that they're still, it was a show of power, that they're still very much active. And I think this is also fanned by what we see in our neighboring state of India, the role of Hindutva and the anti-Muslim, the kind of acts that are taking place and the kind of propaganda that is being spread everywhere has its impact over here too, which makes the Hindu community and the non-Muslim community, others, feel much more vulnerable. And if I look at Sri Lanka, where I used to hear what Malka has also discussed, is when the LTTE and the kind of actions that are taking place. But now, when I talk to my friends from Sri Lanka, from the anti-Tamil discourse or discussion, it's an anti-Muslim narrative that is being put forward. And the anti-Muslim narrative lumps all Muslims as one, no matter what your ethnicity. I don't see people talking about Sinhala Christians. I see Muslims as Muslims. So you may be Tamil, you may be Moor, you may be from any other any other ethnicity, but it's all lumped as one. And that's we find that's happening. So this kind of use of religion as an ideology, as a means of control and creating the other, is what is happening all the time. And I see that as I see the government giving huge amounts of money for mosques, building mosques, and giving a lot of money to the madrasas, the religious educations. But as compared to giving money to other religious, minority religious groups in terms of temples and all that. So, as I said, that there were all these efforts being taken place, and each time it is for the political party to remain in power, so whichever the political party may be, and it's not not in any way related to what the people on the ground want. So when we talk about the essentials of inclusive culture, how do we describe it? What is this, the inclusive culture? Actually, when we talk about secularism, and secularism was often described as a bad word, as anti-religion, which in our part of the world, I think, secularism was meant as being everyone having the right to have their own, right to practice what they believed in or not believed in, and they didn't believe. So that was it. It's the question of the othering, trying to formulate the othering so much, and the domination of one group over the other. I want to mention here the Chittagong Hill Tracts particularly. The Chittagong Hill Tracts is in the southeast of Bangladesh, and it's a hilly area where traditionally it has always been the indigenous communities who live over there. There are about 13 indigenous groups living there. And they were over 98% of the population of the Chittagong Hill Tracts. 1900, the British had a particular special Chittagong Hill Tracts rule and law of how it will be functioning, how the land will be related, which is taking into consideration that this is an indigenous area to be ruled by the customary laws of the area. So in the mid-70s, when the indigenous communities were not, especially from the hill tracts, were not being given any voice, and we were under military dictatorship, there was military operations in the Chittagong Hill Tracts going on. What has happened now is that there was a deliberate attempt at bringing in Bengali Muslims from the plainlands of Bangladesh all over and settling them there. So there is a demographic change, so that from being a 98% indigenous community, they are now 49 point something percent. And in some areas, they're a majority. So this kind of deliberate attempt of trying to wipe out the voices and change the laws and change and the kind of military and other attacks that still continue to take place, even though in 1997, a peace accord was signed by the government of Bangladesh with the indigenous communities through the Parvata Chattogram, the people's collective, which had been in an armed struggle. So this was a peace accord that was signed, which we all welcomed, but that is not implemented. We are seeing up till now that is not being implemented, and that the kind of violations that are taking place in the hill tracts, the human rights violations, and the absolutely taking over every kind of power and strength from the indigenous communities have gone away. So when we find that more and more of this kind of majoritarianism and promoting of it is increasing, there is also a lot of suppression and the use of the Digital Security Act now. You have the print media, which is always monitored But now we have the Digital Security Act, where anybody who uses social media to state anything, and anybody else will say that I am feeling that my rights are violated, or I feel affected, I feel offended. So I may just put something very simple. It may be political, it may not be political. I may be taken under the Digital Security Act, and I may be disappeared, or I may be in jail, and we even had people killed in jail. So, who died in jail. I wouldn't say killed because officially it's not stated as being killed. So extrajudicial killing, fear, everything is going on. And so that is the scenario we're working on. And so much so that people are beginning to now do self-censorship in a way, because they feel that the only way to survive is not to speak up in the way they should. Luckily, there are alternatives, and especially amongst the youth and some of the other people who do believe in what is happening. So I know I've gone, it is half an hour that I was given the time slot, so I'll be ending very soon. I will just say that is there hope. I think the hope is that the kind of movements are taking place are more related to a particular issue, a ethnicity, a religious class, a religious identity, a social identity, your sexuality, rather than a whole totally looking at it intersectionally as a total change of systems and structures. And I think until we start looking at everything and realizing that the only way to change and the only way to look at how can we bring in inclusivity and an inclusive culture is opening up our minds and opening ourselves to looking at the total picture and the systems and structures in place that encourage and foster and feed this kind of division. So it is very important that we do it. Yes, Bangladesh itself globally has a positive image in many ways of having moved economically. From being a least developed country, it's now on the way of progress of moving towards a middle income country. It hasn't reached it yet, but it's been given the approval that it can move towards that. In many of these social development goals, we've done quite well. Yet, the rate of child marriage, the rate of violence against women, insecurity of its citizens remain, and human rights violations remain a very large target. We think that in order to look at how can we bring in that inclusive culture, I think it's extremely important, the kind of discussion we're having now, sharing with each other and reaching out to a much larger population, reaching out towards everywhere that we can. And the more we are, I think the more important it is that the voices will grow and we can start looking at making changes. I just want to end by saying that I don't think the kind of democracy we have of just an election one day and electing and the winner gets the majority votes, etc., is the way that we should be moving forward as being democratic. Democracy to me means asking questions and ensuring you get the answers and answers that you are satisfied with. That kind of accountability and the impunity, the culture of impunity that exists has to go, and that can only go when the people actually get together and start talking. So I would just say that, yes, we think it's time for all of us to start working together, and we work in terms of all the different groups who think seriously are acting in a more collective way, sharing, and as I say, not forgetting at all the larger picture, that we don't look at one part only of the issue that affects us, but look at the total system and structure. And what is it? It's class, it's patriarchy, and it's kind of the use of religion that pushes the structure in the way it does and allows the structure to manifest itself in such a negative and such a brutal manner. I don't want to leave on such a negative note. I just want to say that I believe, because our history, centuries of history has shown that the people at one point do come together and do resist. How do we make this resistance tangible and lasting is important. How do we bring our collective efforts across the region together is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Kabir, for covering many aspects that endangered in South Asia and the need for inclusiveness in Bangladesh in particular and South Asia at large. Thank you for awakening the hope to change the conditions by opening our minds to the kind of democracy we need to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We now move on to the last part of the session. We are honored to have Mr. Jatin Desai from Mumbai to chair this session. Jatin Desai is a renowned senior journalist and a peace activist. He writes and speaks on nuclear disarmament, peace, and conflict resolutions in context of international affairs in general and India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and other SAARC countries and West Asia in particular. He's a former secretary of India chapter of Pakistan India People's Forum for Peace and Democracy and bureau member of South Asians for Human Rights. In today's era, where freedom of expression and speech is endangered, Mr. Jatin Desai has fought many battles for the freedom of speech and has been a crusader for that throughout his life. I welcome Mr. Jatin Desai to express his remarks as the chairperson for this session. Sir.
Sorry, I will not take a long time because we were to end this session at 1:30 and we are already at 1:40. But it was a great listening to Mahendra Lahoti, Taymou Rahman, Malka, Fernando, Khushi Kabir. In fact, they enlightened us on various aspects. But I think one thing is very common because yesterday we spoke about Indian scenario. So whatever we are witnessing today, it's what everyone spoke today is the same what we discussed yesterday. We are South Asian, we are facing many challenges, including majoritarianism, that right from today, Mahendra Lahoti said, Mahendra Lahoti especially emphasized on Khas Arya. This particular community, which is about 31% of the Nepalese population, but they are dominating every sphere, right from politics to business to civil society, everywhere they are in a dominant position. And since 1990s, all the prime ministers of Nepal came from this particular community. This is absolutely a new thing for me. So I think that this we need to realize the difference between India and Nepal, one can say, that this Khas Arya community is of upper caste. This and upper caste are ruling Nepal since 1990s. This has Mahendra Lahoti emphasized.
Excuse me,
And
sir.
I think that's a new constitution which came into existence in 2015. There are many aspects, there are many negative aspects, and Nepalese witnessed economic blockade during that period. And in fact, South Asians for Human Rights, we did a very detailed study on the impact of economic blockade since new constitution came into existence. So it's absolutely that we need to discuss more on this issue. There are 7 provinces, and Mahendra Rawati categorically said that out of 7 provinces, in 6 provinces, it's a caste area. They are demographically dominant community. Taimur, Taimur gave a detailed account of Pakistan scenario. Taimur gave a detailed account of Pakistan scenario and how Abida Parveen electrified the Pakistanis. He narrated that, and in today's scenario, he spoke about how Barelvi sect is getting radicalized, and that is at one time it was a hope. Barelvi and Sufism. Sufism is hope even today. We all sing Sufi songs, we respect Sufi culture, and in fact, we compared Sufi culture with our Bhakti Sampradaya in India. So that's, I think, that's a very positive thing that still people are fighting for their rights, and Sufism is a hope, I think, and that's what our friend Taymou Rahman and his comrades, and there are thousands of other students and civil society groups which are active on this issue. And he rightly referred about the Salman Taseer scenario. It was very tragic. That's a Maulvis from Barelvi sect also refused to bury at that particular time in 2011 the body of Salman Taseer. So Nimalka spoke about how Sri Lankans are facing crisis, and this particular economic crisis is the worst because just a couple of days ago, India helped Sri Lanka by $500 million line of credit so that they can get fuel. This is the scenario. And if we talk about South Asia, there is always tendency of small nations. It is not confined only to South Asia. You see, globally, that a small nation always tries to bargain with the bigger nation, bigger nation for their welfare. And that's what we can find in case of Sri Lanka as well as in case of Maldives. Because we need to see Sri Lanka and Maldives scenario quite similar in the sense. And influence of China, obviously, China's influence is growing everywhere, be it in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, even in Bangladesh. Because in Bangladesh, China has exempted around 97% of Bangladesh items which they export to China. Absolutely, they are tax free. So this is the scenario. So smaller nations tries to get benefit of various big nations for their benefit, but ultimately what we are witnessing in Sri Lanka is a very scary scenario. So I think that Khushi analyzed about the Bangladesh scenario and 1971 struggle. 1971 struggle, we all remember. We were small at that time, we were kids, but we remember the liberation struggle of Bangladesh. And from that struggle, the first constitution of Bangladesh stood for secularism, stood for inclusiveness, and it was a republic, democratic, secular, socialist constitution. Gradually, after the assassination of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his family members in 1975, the constitution was amended, changed. So, but still struggle goes on. Still struggle is on. And Kushika will rightly say that there is a hope, which says that people do come together. And ultimately, the collective efforts of everyone, we hope, will bring some changes, some positive changes. And I think as a South Asia, because we are discussing South Asia, so let us also hope, and we should also try to influence our governments so that SARC become a reality. Because last SARC summit was held in 2014 in Nepal. Next was to held in 2016 in Pakistan. But unfortunately, it could not be held because of Uri attack. But this is the time. This is the time that we need to revive SARC, because SARC gives some hope. If we talk about Asian nations or European nations or NAFTA, we lag far behind because the intra-trade of SARC nations is less than 5%, while it is around 35% of ASEAN, which starts from Myanmar and includes Cambodia, Philippines, Brunei, Laos, and these nations. And in European nations, European Union, it is around 50%. So I think we need to work on seeing that SARC becomes a reality. SARC held regularly, and also we need to have more interaction with our friends from other nations. And now social media has made this quite possible. We need to have more friends from other nations. We need to have some exchanges with them. I think this is the lesson we should take. We should decide that we need to have more interactions with other South Asian nations and try to understand their issues, their problems, and how we can express solidarity with them. I think I'll stop here because it's already 1:50. Thanks.
Thank you, sir, for your elaborate critical remarks on the contemporary issues discussed in this session and the need to have a more interactive community across the borders in South Asia. With this, I declare this session over. Thank you all the participants for being here on this virtual platform, and also to the audience for being here with us. We'll meet for the next session after the break at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Thank you.